Okay, hopefully it stays. We're trying to standardize cauldron thicknesses. Anyone know where this quote comes from? Thank you, Harry Potter. Excellent. There are a few muggles in the room, I'm glad to see. Book 4, if you're interested. What this tells us is a couple of things. First of all, it tells us that J.K. Rowling is really smart because she understands the value of standards. The second thing that's much more important is it tells us that even in a world of magic, standards are important. You can't live without them. So standards really, really do matter, and that's what I want to help convey to you with my presentation. Back in the old days of publishing, and by this I mean, my gray hairs are starting to show, so I'm talking about 1990, this is what it looked like. You'd get typescript manuscripts, you'd edit on paper, and you'd publish something in print. There weren't a lot of standards that publishers had to adhere to. I mean, there were editorial style guides, but that's not the kind of standard I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is some of the older standards that apply to publishers, such as ISSN, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, ISBN, acid-free paper is that third one, an ANSI NISO standard. And there was actually a standard on presentation of periodicals. I wonder how many people may have looked at it through the years. And I think, Todd, someone mentioned the standard for text on spines earlier this morning.
Yes. Printed information on spines.
Printed information on spines. There is, how many of you are still printing? There is a standard for that. But the reality is, aside from a few that really directly impacted publishers, most of the standards in the community really, and what I call the community in this case is TC46, which is an ISO subgroup, were directed at librarians rather than publishers. It was things, again, someone mentioned steel shelving this morning. When I was on the NISO board, that was always the one we laughed about. Did we really want to keep this as an active standard? Because who is buying steel shelving these days? Anyone following the whole New York Public Library thing? They wanted to get rid of all of their stacks underneath. What were they going to do with all their old steel shelving, I wonder? Anyhow, if we move forward to 2000, what I call New Millennium Publishing, by that point, publishers were still mostly in print, but starting to think about electronic. But the reality is there were few standards that existed in terms of electronic publication. The publishers that were doing XML, it was largely proprietary. And any early adopters of CrossRef here, back in 2000, you actually had to convince people that CrossRef was a good thing. That's sort of now a foregone conclusion, I hope. Anyhow, publishers, again, even as far back as 2000, weren't worrying about standards. Well, that's all changed because in 2014, we're no longer talking about ink on paper and giving an ISSN or an ISBN to it so that a librarian can track it better. We're talking about online first, full-text XML, electronic metadata deliveries, and enhanced documents, linked references, linked data, linked authors, linked funders. I saw a demo of ReadCube the other day, and I'd never seen it before, and they're doing some really cool stuff enhancing PDFs, throwing in all kinds of extra links. This is really cool stuff. In order to do all this, however, you need standards, and what you need is not just standards, but you need an ecosystem of standards. It's standards that all work together. And that's what's critically important in all of this, is thinking about standards not as isolated islands, but working together. They interconnect so that you can have seamless workflows from submission through production to publication and even post-publication. I've thrown post-publication deliberately because, unfortunately, if you look around at Retraction Watch, retractions are on the increase, I believe, at a faster rate than the growth of overall publication itself. So post-publication curation is an ever more important part of the workflow. Nettie mentioned JATS earlier. How many of you are familiar with JATS? Good part of the room. How many of you are familiar with the NLM-DTD? How many of you know that they're the same thing? Just renamed. Good. Now you all know. JATS was the name that was adopted when the NLM-DTD became a project of NISO, so under Todd's and Nettie's guidance now. It started out, however, back in 2002 as a project to be a solution for markup. It wasn't conceived of as a workflow solution, but now, as you'll see through my slides, there are so many interconnection points that I like to think of it as a workflow solution, a framework for a workflow solution, where you can integrate not just full text enriched metadata, but you can facilitate the entire workflow. So, for example, I know that at least some of the online submission systems can give you the transmittal information in a JATS format. You can then integrate that into your production activities, and in the end, you can use JATS as your master format for distributing metadata to various consumers of that metadata. So there are a number of various standards and other projects around JATS that form this ecosystem, and I want to run through some of them quickly. BITS, supplemental journal article materials, ORCID. I want to talk for a few minutes about some of the activities around CrossRef and JATS. I want to touch from a slightly different perspective on open access metadata indicators that Nettie was just talking about, and finally I'll mention Chorus. So, first question, how many of you publish books as well? How many of you are familiar with BITS? Okay, we have JATS and we now have BITS. What BITS is the Book Interchange Tag Suite. It's based on the same core as JATS. So all of the internal tagging is the same. What's different is the outer level wrappers. So we're now saying this isn't a journal article, it's a book. And we have all the interesting things that would be associated with books. And because you have the same core tagging inside, we literally are working with some publishers where they publish a journal article first, and then they take that and they repurpose it maybe a year or two later into a chapter of a book. And what's really cool is they don't have to change any of the internal tagging. All they have to do is change the metadata wrapper around that core. That's what's great about having this kind of a compatible tag set. It's based on the old NLM book DTD, which you may or may not be familiar with. So the differences between them, we have book-specific metadata. So there's an ISBN in the metadata for BITS. There isn't in JATS. We have a book structure model. So we handle things such as forewords, preface, dedication. We can have a table of contents in it, because one of the things book publishers told us is we sometimes have information in our table of contents we can't generate automatically from the XML of each individual chapter. We may have an annotated table of contents, for example. There's a full index model in BITS. It uses a technology called X-include, so what you can actually have are separate XML files for each chapter, and then have a master file that includes each of these chapter files. That's something that's not in JATS. And it's got a question and answer and quiz model, something, again, that's not in JATS. We have had a few requests on the JATS working group for that, but it is already something that is in BITS. So a lot of really cool stuff if you're looking to do books, and if you're already a user of JATS, you can keep all the same basic technology foundation. The status of BITS is 0.2 was released in October 2012. 1.0 was released last December. The URL for it is up on screen. Again, if you don't want to write down the whole URL, please email me. My email address is on the last slide. I'm happy to send you any of these as with any of the other panelists. Next steps, get it, use it. If you have feedback on the DTD, send it to the working group. The working group is actively interested in the feedback. So send that information along. Switching gears a little bit. Supplemental journal article materials. How many of you publish supplementary information? Most of the people in the room. How many of you have read this document? Okay. Please go to this link, read this. This is a series of best practices for both business and technical issues around publishing supplemental material. If you haven't read this and you're publishing supplemental material, you may well be reinventing wheels and making some of the same mistakes that people made 10 years ago. If you read this document, you'll get a much better feel for what are some of the things you can do and should do, and what are some of the things that you want to avoid. So it's a really, really important recommended practice that came out of, again, NISO last year. This was spearheaded up. I don't know how many of you know Linda Beebe. She's now retired, longtime member of SSP, past president of SSP. She was one of the people who spearheaded the group for this recommended practice. So well worth your time to pull the document and read through it. You're all familiar with ORCID? How many of you are actually using ORCID now? Good number of people. Okay, so you've got it worked into your submission system. Part of the trick with ORCID is creating a workflow to get those ORCIDs from the submission metadata all the way through, ideally without a single copy and paste in the middle. Therein lies the bugaboo. ORCID is a matter, ORCID, the organization, as a matter of protecting the integrity of ORCIDs, is trying to encourage people not to use copy and paste in the workflow. That's not a simple thing, because what you need to do is merge the metadata from the transmittal with what's in the Word file as you're trying to put all the XML together. If you're trying to do this, first of all, if you're not already on JATS 1.0, if you're still on an earlier version of the NLMDTD, you want to upgrade to JATS 1.0 because it has a contributor ID element where you can stick that. And this is actually from an ORCID presentation. This shows some workflow information around ORCID. The critical one is bottom center where it says XML to CrossRef. Well, if you've got that ORCID ID that came from the transmittal into your JATS XML, then you can push it up to CrossRef. And I'm going to have more slides later on as I talk about other initiatives to show why this is so important. But what you really want to do is make sure you're getting that seamless end-to-end workflow. And again, JATS can become the hub where you're keeping all of this metadata. So talking about CrossRef, there are a bunch of things going on with CrossRef that can intersect with JATS. CrossMark, CrossRef Metadata Services, FundRef, and LicenseRef. CrossMark, again, how many of you are familiar with it? Most of the people in the room. How many of you are participating in it? Ooh, get Carol Meyer up here to do some proselytizing. That was not a good show of hands. One of the reasons I want to encourage everyone to get involved with CrossMark is because you can indicate post-publication updates. Now, one of the things that people don't understand about CrossMark, as it turns out, is they think if you go into it, you have to go and update all of your old PDFs. Guess what? You don't have to do that. You can leave them alone. However, you can deposit the CrossMark metadata to CrossRef. So you can deposit information to CrossRef, letting them know that this article has been corrected, this one has a retraction, without necessarily updating your PDFs. What's the value of that? Well, the value of that is when machines start accessing CrossRef to learn about articles, they can suddenly flag, whoops, this article's been retracted. That's important for you to catch. So there are systems, for example, that could catch this at submission. If an author has a reference list in a submitted manuscript, that can be linked out in the submission process, and instantly the editor can see, whoops, a retracted citation is in this reference list. That's the kind of thing that we can get by having that metadata in CrossRef, even if you don't update your PDF. So please go and do that. One piece of news on CrossMark, when it first came out, there was not a standardized vocabulary for the type of correction. CrossRef realized that that was creating sort of a Wild West scenario where people couldn't read that metadata at a machine level, so there will be a standardized vocabulary coming for that. I'm not sure what their timeline is. Next one, CrossRef Metadata Services. This is a suite of tools that can allow authorized partners to collect metadata by crawling through CrossRef. This is really cool because it means you can start exposing more information. And some of you have probably already exposed to Google through CrossRef, for example. But this exposes more information with obviously a level of control for the publisher. What's interesting about this is there are a few JATS implications. The first is that the CrossRef deposit schema now accepts MathML if that appears in an article title. It didn't used to do that. So you can now get a richer resolution title into CrossRef for the indexing purposes. More importantly, the CrossRef deposit schema now accepts an abstract of the article from the JATS XML. So you can literally take the JATS XML verbatim of that abstract and stick it into your CrossRef deposit, and that can now be crawled through CrossRef Metadata Services. So particularly if you want to expose that information through yet another channel, because after all, authors, or researchers I should say, are getting to your content through more and more different channels. This is one way that you can expose that information, is by making that abstract available. FundRef. Again, how many of you know about it? This is great. Everyone knows about these initiatives. How many are participating? Okay, more proselytizing. If you're not participating now, start looking at who's funding your authors, because chances are they're going to want you to participate. Because what the funders want to know is what the research output is, and they want to know about this on a machine-readable basis. They don't want to have to track all this manually. So there are ways now that you can mark up the funding information, and you can do that in JATS. And this, by the way, is a plug for JATS 1.1, the latest version. There's 1.1 D1, 1.1 D2 will be coming probably within a month or so, I think. We've got another committee call. Is it next week, Nettie? I think it's next week, yeah. Anyhow, we added institution ID. I'm talking with my working group hat on right now. What that means is that now you can apply the CrossRef FundRef DOI to the funder as you tag it in the JATS XML, which is really neat stuff. You can also, if you think about the affiliations for your authors, you can look up a Ringgold ID and embed that into your JATS XML as well. And again, you can push this through the entire feed. There's a lot more information about FundRef on the CrossRef site. I don't want to spend a lot of time going into detail in that, but just again to make you aware of how all of this interplays with JATS as part of a holistic workflow. This slide is from CrossRef. Again, it shows the FundRef workflow, and again, the trick is getting that information into the JATS XML, and that in and of itself is a little bit tricky because you often get the information coming in an acknowledgement paragraph as sort of free-form text. So I actually picked off some acknowledgements just at random from different articles in PubMed Central. Any funder that's in green is in the CrossRef FundRef Registry, and this is their database based on the Elsevier data. And I apologize if this slide is a little out of date. I did this research for this slide late last year, so there may have been an update since then. Anything that's in red was not in the CrossRef Registry, and anything that's in orange was in there but not with an exact match. So one of the tricks with all this is copy editing the acknowledgement paragraph to match what's in the CrossRef Registry. That's not a small piece of work, but it's something to think about if you really want to make all of this work. And then maybe embedding the DOI from CrossRef in so that you actually have the DOI for a funder as well. And then marking up, obviously, the grant numbers as well in all of this, but getting all of that into your XML. Some of you, I know, are trying to collect that information from a controlled vocabulary during the submission process from your authors. I talked to Evan Owens from AIP a couple of months ago, and he said, yeah, we're getting about 20% author compliance, even though it's a required field on submission. So part of it's also educating the authors, hey, you got to start giving us this information to make sure that you're going to get your next grant, because this is all going to start tying together. But think about all this, again, let's collect it up front, let's harmonize this with what's in the acknowledgement paragraph, let's get it into our XML, and again, you'll see why when I get to one of my final slides this becomes critically important. The next thing that I want to talk about is license metadata. This starts to tie into what Nettie was talking about with the Open Access Metadata Indicators project. OA has clearly brought lots of new licensing implications. Back in the days of print, we didn't have all of this. And a key issue in this is not only to make sure that you've got a machine-readable license in your content, but also to make sure that it's correct. There's actually a wonderful paper that was presented at JATSCon, which is the annual JATS DTD conference, that was presented in April, this past April 2014, on inconsistent XML as a barrier to reuse of open access content. And someone from Wikimedia basically was trying to mine open access images from PubMed Central. And what he found is that the tagging of the license information was incredibly inconsistent. So here's an example that came out of his paper, where it was CC BY, but if you look at the text that had been put into the XML, does not permit commercial exploitation. Well, if you read the definition of CC BY, though the attribute and the text are in direct contradiction with each other. And I know that a lot of you are offering many different flavors of open access to your authors, but it's critically important to make sure that this information is right, because when faced with something like that, you can't data mine. What gets even worse is if you then deposit this to CrossRef, CrossRef takes the information in the attribute, and they will stick it into a license ref element, when you deposit the metadata? Well, you've just told CrossRef that, by the way, you've got full commercial exploitation of this item, even though that's what your text said you didn't have. So you want to be really, really careful about all this metadata to make sure that it's all consistent, correct, and seamless end-to-end in your workflow. So where this all leads to ultimately is this project that Nettie was talking about of trying to get some recommended practices around indicating what's open, what's free to read, to use the term that the working group is using. And again, there are some implications with JATS. JATS already has elements for license information and open access, and we're not sure what's going to happen with those elements. We're waiting for the working group to come out with the recommended practice. So basically, stay tuned to the NISO site, and then stay tuned to JATS to see what happens with this. But this is one of those things that once it's out there and we've got the recommended practice and JATS all playing together and CrossRef accepting all of this data, this has an impact on you that you want to consider to make sure that your metadata is consistent. Okay. Whoops. Sorry about that. Will fit if I get it right. There we go. Okay. Whoops. Gotta start playing it again. Okay. Where this all comes together in a big way is Chorus. Now, before I get into Chorus, how many of you have content on PubMed Central? How many of you feel like you're losing page views to PubMed Central? How many of you are happy about that? Okay, I figured that's what the answer would be. Chorus is a different way to meet an ever-expanding initiative from the U.S. government. Because the idea fundamentally behind Chorus is the U.S. government doesn't co-host your content. The U.S. government instead can get people to your content on your site if they've funded it and it's freely available. Does that sound a lot more appealing to you? I figured as much. The key behind all of this, to make all of this work, is the metadata deposits to CrossRef. It needs the FundRef information, it needs the CrossMark information, it needs the ORCID information, it needs the license ref information, and it needs the DOI links. So we're talking about a whole bunch of different standards and recommended practices all coming together to make Chorus work. But it's not just about Chorus, because ultimately it's about your content and your information. And if you get all of this metadata right and you build the right workflows for having all of this metadata work, it suddenly becomes a real working ecosystem for all of this. So what's the most important message that I want you to take away from the last 20 minutes? First, I don't want you to reinvent the wheel. If you feel like you need to do something new, look around to see if there's a standard for it, or a recommended practice, one or the other. Second, start thinking about standards not as individual things, each on their own, but as an ecosystem where all of this stuff interplays with each other. And what you want to do is step back and look at it holistically. And once you begin to do that, then what you want to do is review, what are your metadata requirements? What are you taking in? What's important to you? What's important to the funders behind the authors that you're publishing? What's important to your downstream content distribution channels? Then what you want to do is, once you think about it from that level and you've mapped out all the metadata, think about what the workflow is to integrate all of this in a really clean, holistic fashion. As part of that, consider going to JATS 1.1D1. You may discover it's got elements that you're going to need in order to support this on a full end-to-end workflow. Then what you want to do is step back and say, okay, what are we doing today in our workflow? What do we need to revise to really take advantage of this and make sure it all hangs together properly? And QA is a vital part of this. You mess up on the metadata, you're going to be messing up your authors in terms of getting new grants. You're going to be messing up in terms of people discovering your content. So QA of all this is vitally important, and it's no longer about just QAing what's on the printed page. I mean, people used to cringe if there was a typo in an author name or an article title. Those were the two most critical fields of metadata. Well, now it's a lot worse because there's a lot of metadata that you don't see on the page, and you've got to have proper proofing for that. And finally, once you've got this in place, what you can do is a much more efficient and accurate job of providing rich metadata to all of your customers being anyone downstream to whom you're distributing this, whether it's CrossRef, whether it's PubMed or PubMed Central, whether it's OA funders, whether it's anyone else. So that's my takeaway from this morning, and thank you very much. I'm ready for any questions.
Okay, so if we have any questions, actually, we have about 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes?
6 minutes.
6 minutes?
It's 12:09.
5.
And we can take questions from the other panelists, too.
So if anybody has any questions or topics, yeah?
Has there been any talk of a mining rep tag in addition to license reps? We're CC by NC, but we allow commercial mining index.
So repeating the question for the
Has there been any talk about a tag from mining? Not that I'm aware of. Is
No,
anyone
someone
else?
mentioned it to me last night, but no, it's not.
You might want to feed that into the Open Access Metadata Indicators group. That might be a good place to start. Other
There's
questions?
one in the back,
There was one in the back?
over there.
Yeah, you?
Yes. Can you speak up a little bit?
We work for publishers. It's just a fundamental question. We get word submissions, we normalize it to XML, and we have DTPs, we are creating the workflow, we're designing the workflow. Do you see any forum which is working on text submissions? Is there any TDD developments for text? How are we going to normalize text submissions? Is there an effort?
I don't think the standards really, the question is, what do we do? We work with Word and convert that to XML, but what do we do about normalizing text submissions? That's not really a standards issue. That's more of sort of a production workflow issue, because ultimately what you're trying to do, I would believe, is get to JATS XML at the end of the day for the publisher. I'm certainly happy to talk with you offline about some of the issues around tech, but that's not, I think, a standards issue so much as it is just a workflow issue. Other questions? Yes?
I spoke with someone related from our content provider, our compositor, about FundRef, about what he'd noticed among other publications, and he had said he had noticed occasions of duplication of entries because of non-standard ways of entering FundRef, that there were still things that needed to be tweaked when it came to FundRef.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that you guys are dealing with at this time, or do you have an answer for that kind of issue that comes up?
Yeah, the question is, he's noticed inconsistency in FundRef information and what's being done to sort of tweak that to get the inconsistencies out of the system. What CrossRef is trying to do on their end is expand the database of funders that they have. They started out with 4,000 from Elsevier. They've discovered that there are far more than 4,000 funding agencies around the world. In terms of how authors cite the names of those funders, that is unfortunately trying to get that consistency about as good a chance as getting them to be consistent with other parts of the manuscript. Authors will do whatever they want because they're the smartest people in the world and they think they know better. I apologize if anyone in the room is an author and you feel like that's a slight. That's just the reality of what authors submit, and I see it on a day-to-day basis. That's part of the job of the publisher, ultimately, is getting that normalized in a fashion when the author has done a poor job so that it does get out there in a way that it is consistent and useful to others. I mean, that for me, aside from peer review and branding as part of that, that for me is one of the biggest roles of the publisher, is making sure that they're taking care of the overall curation of things that need to be there, including the metadata.
You mentioned, you alluded to that in your presentation. I was just curious, are you talking about on the front end or more toward the compositional end of your work on our part?
Yes. The question is, am I talking about more of the front end of submission or more of the production end of this? My answer was yes, I'm talking about both, because what you really want to do is look at your overall workflow, look at where the various data inputs are coming from. So some might come from the submission system, some might come from the Word manuscript, but also look at your outputs. What do you need to produce at the end? And then begin to map out, well, how do I get from A to B? How do I get from my inputs to my outputs in a way that is consistent and robust and will provide quality? And how that happens may not be the same for every publisher, because different publishers may have different metadata requirements. What it's important, though, is to be aware that you're looking at the entire workflow holistically and how you can pull it all together.
Anyone else? Okay, we have just one more minute before we leave, and I want to highlight the fact that tomorrow there's going to be, during the roundtable lunch, there'll be a table to continue this conversation about standards or technology, production workflows, if anyone wants to join us. I have no idea how you'll find that table, but I'm sure there'll be, when you get to lunch tomorrow afternoon, there should be signs and a numbering schema of some sort. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.